He was jailed at 18 and released at 80 for a crime that never existed. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The morning air had a particular chill on November 12, 2023. The kind that seeps into your bones and reminds you that winter is approaching. But for one man standing outside the gates of Rockwell Federal Correctional Facility, the cold was the least of his concerns. Walter Simmons, 80 years old, his hands trembling not from the temperature but from the weight of the moment, clutched a manila envelope containing his freedom papers. "Mr. Simmons, how does it feel to be innocent after 6 decades behind bars?" shouted a reporter from the crowd gathered outside the prison. Walter's weathered face, etched with deep lines that mapped a life spent in confinement, remained expressionless. His eyes, though pale blue and watery, darted around nervously. Unaccustomed to so much open space, so many faces, so much commotion. "They never wanted the truth," he mumbled, his voice barely audible over the clicking cameras and bustling reporters. Standing at the edge of the crowd, Rebecca Thompson adjusted her glasses and watched intently. At 35, she'd spent the last 18 months of her journalism career obsessively researching Walter's case. Unlike the other reporters jostling for a soundbite, she knew better than to bombard him now. Their relationship had been built through prison, visitation glass, letter by letter, as she pieced together what would become the most controversial investigation of her career. "Give him some space," she called out, though few paid attention. A prison official guided Walter toward a waiting car, his gait unsteady after decades of walking only. Within confined spaces, he wore a simple button-up shirt and slacks that hung loosely on his frail frame, donated clothes that replaced the uniform he'd worn since Eisenhower was president. 62 years, Rebecca whispered to herself, recording the moment on her phone. "Longer than I've been alive." Walter had entered these gates as an 18-year-old boy in 1960, convicted of murdering Caroline Mason, the beloved daughter of Oak Ridge's mayor. Except, as Rebecca's investigation had uncovered, there was no body, no definitive evidence, nothing but a town's grief, political ambition, and a convenient scapegoat. As Walter settled into the back seat of the car that would take him to his temporary housing, his eyes met Rebecca's across the parking lot. A slight nod passed between them, an acknowledgement of the journey ahead. The car door closed, and Walter Simmons left Rockwell prison for the first time in over 6 decades. Back in her hotel room, Rebecca reviewed her notes and recordings. The magnitude of what they were about to reveal weighed heavily on her. Her podcast Buried Truth had gained traction online, but the final episodes would shake the foundations of the justice system in ways few could imagine. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her editor. "How's our man holding up? Network wants to fast-track the documentary." Rebecca didn't respond immediately. Instead, she opened a folder on her laptop labeled Simmons Case and clicked on a photo of a young Walter from 1960, a teenager with bright eyes and an easy smile, standing beside his father's auto shop. In less than a week after that photo was taken, he would be branded a monster, a killer of a girl who, as Rebecca was beginning to believe, might never have been killed at all. She finally texted back, "He's out, but this is just the beginning." The mystery that had divided a nation was about to be reopened. A young man condemned, a town complicit, a prosecutor with ambition, and somewhere perhaps a truth that had remained buried for 62 years. The summer of 1960 in Oak Ridge, ENC, Ohio was unusually warm, the kind of heat that made the air shimmer above the asphalt. Walter Simmons, 18, wiped sweat from his brow as he worked on a Chevy Bel Air in his father's auto shop. The radio played Elvis Presley's "It's Now or Never," and Walter hummed along, sliding out from under the vehicle to reach for a wrench. "You're getting good at this," said George Simmons, watching his son work with a quiet pride. "But don't forget, come fall, you'll be hitting the books at State College. First Simmons to get a college education." Walter nodded, though his mind was elsewhere. He'd been accepted to study engineering on a partial scholarship, but still needed to save every penny he could. Just 2 more months of grease under my nails, Pop. Then I'm trading it for pencil smudges. Across town at the Mason estate on Hillcrest Drive, Mayor Robert Mason was hosting his annual summer garden party. The social event of the season had transformed their sprawling lawn into a showcase of Oak Ridge's finest citizens, all dressed in their Sunday best despite the heat. Among them, Caroline Mason, the mayor's 18-year-old daughter, moved with practiced grace, her blonde hair catching the sunlight. "Caroline, darling," her mother called. "Come meet Judge Williams, he's on the state Supreme Court." Caroline smiled dutifully, though her eyes reflected a restlessness that few noticed. She excused herself moments later, slipping away to the edge of the property where she could breathe. From her vantage point, she could see the town below, the neat rows of houses, the church spire, and further down, the more modest east side where families like the Simmons lived. That evening, the town of Oak Ridge prepared for another event, the midsummer dance at the high school gymnasium. Walter hadn't planned to attend. College preparations and extra shifts at the garage consumed his time, but his friend Danny insisted. "You can't spend your last summer in Oak Ridge under a car," Danny argued. "Besides, Mary Jenkins has been asking about you." Walter relented, showering off the days. Grime and donning his only decent shirt. He borrowed his father's car, a blue Ford that had seen better days but still ran smoothly thanks to Walter's mechanical skills. At the dance, the gymnasium had been transformed with paper streamers and colored lights. Walter stood awkwardly near the punch bowl, watching couples sway to "Only the Lonely." He didn't notice Caroline Mason enter until a hush fell over the room. It wasn't unusual for the mayor's daughter to attend town events, but the midsummer dance was typically for a different social circle. "She's looking at you," Danny whispered, nudging Walter. "Don't be ridiculous," Walter replied, though he couldn't help but notice her eyes meeting his briefly before she turned away. The night progressed with the usual small-town rhythm, until shortly after 10, when Caroline was seen leaving abruptly. Some would later recall she seemed upset. Others would remember seeing her talking with Peter Parsons, the mayor's accountant, in a heated discussion near the exit. Walter left shortly afterward, tired and ready to return to the familiar comfort of engines and tools. As he drove home along River Road, the shortest route back to the east side, he noticed a car pulled over near Stillwater Bridge. Being a mechanic's son, he slowed down, wondering if someone needed help. He never made it home that night. By morning, Caroline Mason was reported missing. Walter's blue Ford was found abandoned near the bridge, with Caroline's scarf in the passenger seat. Within hours, the entire town was searching for the mayor's daughter, and Walter Simmons found himself at the center of a nightmare that would consume the next 62 years of his life. The interrogation room at the Oak Ridge Police Department was barely 10 feet square, with mint-green walls that had yellowed over time and a flickering fluorescent light that cast harsh shadows. Walter Simmons sat alone at a metal table, his confusion gradually giving way to fear as hours passed. When detectives James Cooper and Frank Harrison finally entered, they brought with them an atmosphere of barely contained hostility. "Let's make this simple, son," Detective Cooper said, dropping a thin file on the table. He was a bulky man with thinning hair and a face carved from decades of suspicion. "We know what happened to Caroline Mason." Walter leaned forward. "She's been found. Is she okay?" Harrison, the younger detective with a razor-sharp crew cut, exchanged glances with his partner. "That's what we're here to find out from you, Walter." The confusion must have shown on Walter's face. "I don't understand. I just saw her at the dance." "And after the dance?" Cooper pressed, moving closer. "When you offered her a ride home?" "I never," Walter began, but Harrison cut him off. "Your car was found at Stillwater Bridge. Her scarf was inside. A witness saw you two arguing." Walter shook his head vigorously. "No, that's not right. I did stop at the bridge, because I saw a car there, but—" "So you admit you were at the bridge?" Cooper interjected, scribbling notes. "Now we're getting somewhere." What Walter couldn't know then was that outside the interrogation room, Mayor Robert Mason was pacing the hallway, demanding answers from Sheriff Lawrence. The Pressure cascading down the chain of command was palpable. Find Caroline, or find someone responsible for her disappearance. Preferably both, and quickly. Back in the interrogation room, the hours blended together. Walter asked repeatedly for a phone call, for his father, for water. Sometimes his requests were acknowledged. Often they weren't. "Just tell us what happened, Walter," Harrison said, his voice softer now, almost friendly. "Everyone makes mistakes. Maybe she threatened to tell someone about your relationship." "What relationship? I barely knew her," Walter protested, his voice hoarse from repeating the same denials. "You expect us to believe the mayor's daughter just happened to be in your car?" Cooper slammed his hand on the table. "Her scarf, Walter. Her scarf with your fingerprints on it." By hour 15, Walter had been awake for over 30 hours. His statements became confused, contradictory. They showed him photos of Caroline, of the river, of his car. They described scenarios with such conviction that Walter began to question his own memories. Maybe she did ask for a ride," he said finally, desperate to make sense of their accusations. "But I didn't hurt her. I would never hurt anyone." Cooper smiled for the first time. "Now we're making progress." By hour 19, Walter Simmons signed a statement he barely understood. It acknowledged giving Caroline a ride, having an argument, stopping at the bridge. The statement was vague about what happened next, carefully worded phrases that suggested a struggle, an accident, panic. "Just sign here, son," Harrison said almost sympathetically. "Then you can get some rest." What the detectives didn't record was the tape recorder that mysteriously malfunctioned during key portions of the interrogation, or the witness statement from Mary Jenkins that contradicted their timeline, but was filed away, never to reach the defense. As Walter was led to a holding cell, exhausted beyond coherent thought, District Attorney Samuel Reynolds was already preparing his press statement on the courthouse steps. "Today we have charged Walter Simmons with the murder of Caroline Mason," Reynolds announced to the gathered reporters, his ambitious eyes gleaming under the camera lights. "This heinous crime has been solved thanks to the diligent work of our police department." A reporter raised her hand. "But sir, no body has been found." Reynolds nodded gravely. "We believe the suspect disposed of Ms. Mason in the Stillwater River. The search continues, but the evidence of his guilt is overwhelming and incontrovertible." In his cell, Walter finally reached his father by phone. "Pop, I didn't do anything wrong," he sobbed. "I don't understand what's happening." George Simmons, voice breaking, made a promise. "I'll find you a lawyer, son, the best I can. They can't just railroad an innocent boy like this." But in Oak Ridge, in 1960, with grief and anger sweeping through the town, like wildfire they could, and they would. The Oak Ridge County Courthouse stood like a stone sentinel in the town square, its neoclassical columns and imposing steps designed to inspire both awe and deference to the law. On September 15, 1960, those steps were crowded with protesters, reporters, and curious citizens as Walter Simmons was escorted inside for his trial. The charges: first-degree murder of Caroline Mason. Thomas Billings, Walter's court-appointed attorney, was a man clearly out of his depth. At 55, he typically handled minor infractions and property disputes, not capital murder cases. His worn briefcase and perpetually worried expression did little to inspire confidence. "Remember, don't speak unless spoken to," Billings whispered as they entered the courtroom. "And try to look less nervous." The courtroom fell silent as Walter entered. He scanned the gallery, finding his father and mother sitting rigidly in the front row. His mother dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief while his father stared straight ahead, jaw clenched in impotent fury. Behind them sat rows of Oak Ridge citizens, their faces a uniform mask of judgment. On the left side, Mayor Mason and his wife occupied special seats, their grief on public display. Judge Harold Wilson, a longtime friend of the Mason family, presided. His gavel cracked like a gunshot, bringing the proceedings to order. Docket number 60 CR 137, the state versus Walter Simmons, the clerk announced. District Attorney Samuel Reynolds rose with the confidence of a man who'd already won. At 35, he was the youngest DA in county history, with political aspirations that extended far beyond Oak Ridge. Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Reynolds began, his voice resonating through the packed courtroom. This case is about trust betrayed and innocence destroyed. Caroline Mason, beloved daughter, student with a bright future and pillar of our community, was taken from us by the calculated actions of the defendant. Walter listened in disbelief as Reynolds painted a picture of him as a jealous, resentful young man from the wrong side of town, obsessed with Caroline. The portrayal was so far from reality that it seemed like they were discussing a stranger. The prosecution's case moved with surprising speed. Detective Cooper testified about the car, the scarf, the signed confession. Margaret Wilson, a chaperone at the dance, claimed she saw Walter and Caroline arguing in the parking lot, a detail Walter was certain was fabricated. "And did you see the defendant follow Ms. Mason out of the gymnasium?" Reynolds asked. "Yes," Margaret replied, though she avoided looking directly at Walter. He seemed determined. When Billings cross-examined witnesses, his questions were tentative, easily deflected by the prosecution's objections, most of which Judge Wilson sustained without hesitation. The most damning testimony came from Peter Parsons, the mayor's accountant. "Caroline confided in me that she was uncomfortable with Walter's attention," he testified, his voice steady. "She mentioned he'd been driving past her house, watching her." Walter gripped the table, whispering urgently to his lawyer, "That's a lie. I never—" "Quiet," Billings hissed. "Your turn will come." But when Walter finally took the stand 3 days into the trial, he found himself trapped in a web of clever questioning. Reynolds twisted his words, presented partial truths as established facts, and repeatedly referenced the confession Walter had signed in exhaustion. "So, you admit being with Caroline at the bridge," Reynolds pressed. "I stopped because I saw a car, but she wasn't—" "Yes or no, Mr. Simmons?" "It wasn't like that. Your Honor, please instruct the witness to answer the question," Reynolds said smoothly. By the time Walter stepped down, his credibility was in tatters. The jury's expressions told him everything he needed to know. Closing arguments came on day 5. Reynolds stood before the jury, his voice solemn. "No body has been found," he acknowledged, "but the evidence points to only one conclusion. Walter Simmons took Caroline Mason to that bridge, and when she rejected him, he silenced her forever in the dark waters of the Stillwater River." The jury deliberated for just 4 hours. As the foreman stood to deliver the verdict, Walter's mother gripped her husband's hand so tightly her knuckles whitened. "On the count of murder in the first degree, we find the defendant, Walter Simmons, guilty." The gallery erupted. Mrs. Simmons collapsed against her husband, who caught her with trembling hands. Mayor Mason nodded grimly, his wife sobbing into his shoulder. Judge Wilson's sentencing was swift and merciless. "Walter Simmons, you have been found guilty of a most heinous crime. I hereby sentence you to life imprisonment, without the possibility of parole." As Walter was led away in handcuffs, he locked eyes with Samuel Reynolds, who was already accepting congratulations from colleagues. In that moment, a silent understanding passed between them. Reynolds had secured his political future, and Walter had lost everything. Outside the courthouse, Reynolds addressed the waiting press. Behind the cameras, unnoticed by most, Peter Parsons watched the proceedings with an unreadable expression before quietly slipping away. Time passes differently behind bars. For Walter Simmons, the days stretched into weeks, months, and eventually decades, each one marked with the same routine, the same walls, the same burden of injustice. His first 5 years at Lakeland State Penitentiary were spent in near constant fear. A young man, convicted of murdering a girl, was a target, and Walter learned quickly to keep his head down, his back to the wall, and his thoughts to himself. The bruises faded, but the wariness never did. "I'm innocent," he told his cellmate once, a grizzled man serving 20 years for armed robbery. Kid in here. Everybody's innocent, the man replied with a hollow laugh. Best forget about out there. This is your life now. But Walter couldn't forget. Every Sunday, his parents visited without fail. His mother brought homemade cookies when permitted. His father brought news of appeals and potential lawyers who might take another look at the case. Hope sustained them all, fragile though it was. In 1967, Walter was transferred to Rockwell Federal after a prison riot at Lakeland. The change brought new routines, new faces, but the same confinement. He began keeping a journal, recording his thoughts, memories, and the small details of prison life. On the first page, he wrote, "If I am innocent, someday someone will prove it." By 1973, his father's health was failing. The visits became less frequent, the updates on legal efforts more discouraging. The Simmons had exhausted their savings, mortgaged their home, and sold the auto shop to pay for attorneys who ultimately couldn't break through the wall of circumstantial evidence and procedural roadblocks. "Don't give up, son," George Simmons said during what would be his last visit, his once strong frame now hunched and frail. "The truth has to come out sometime." George Simmons passed away 3 weeks later. Walter's request to attend the funeral was denied. His mother held on for another 5 years, writing letters weekly until her handwriting became shaky, then illegible. When the letters stopped coming in 1978, Walter received the news from a prison chaplain. He was now truly alone. Meanwhile, Samuel Reynolds' career flourished as predicted. District attorney became state attorney general, then federal judge. Each promotion took him further from Oak Ridge and the case that launched his career. Occasionally, reporters would ask about the Mason case, and Reynolds would respond with practiced gravity about justice served and the closure brought to a grieving community. Walter watched the world change through small black and white television sets in prison common rooms. Presidents came and went. Wars began and ended. Technology transformed society. Through it all, he aged from a teenager to a middle-aged man, then to an elderly one, his hair graying, then whitening, his shoulders gradually stooping under the weight of time and confinement. In his journal, every single day, he wrote the same sentence: "If I am innocent, someday someone will prove it." By 2022, that journal had grown to fill 62 notebooks, stacked carefully in his cell. And on a crisp autumn morning, a letter arrived from a journalist named Rebecca Thompson, asking questions about a case everyone else had forgotten. Rebecca Thompson's office at Midwest Media Group was more storage closet than workspace, with stacks of files competing for territory with cold coffee mugs. A corkboard dominated one wall, pinned with articles, photos, and red string connecting seemingly disparate elements. What her colleagues jokingly called her conspiracy wall. "You want to do a podcast about what?" Her editor, Mike Daniels, leaned against her doorframe, coffee in hand, expression skeptical. Rebecca pointed to a yellowed newspaper clipping. "The Walter Simmons case, 1960. 18-year-old convicted of murdering the mayor's daughter in Oak Ridge, Ohio. Except there was no body. Flimsy evidence, and he's been in prison for over 6 decades. Sounds like every other true crime podcast." Mike sighed. "What makes this different?" Rebecca pulled out a folder. "I've been going through digitized court records from the period. Something's off about this case. The trial lasted 5 days, practically a speed record for a murder case in 1960. Key witnesses had connections to the mayor's office. And get this, the victim's body was never found, not even a trace." Mike raised an eyebrow. "Cold cases without bodies aren't exactly rare. But this one has inconsistencies everywhere," Rebecca insisted, her eyes bright with the fervor that had earned her both awards and reprimands in her career. The confession was obtained after 19 hours of questioning without counsel. The judge was a family friend of the Masons, and the prosecutor, Samuel Reynolds. "Wait, Judge Reynolds, the federal judge?" Rebecca nodded. "The very same. This case made his career. and I think he knew exactly what he was doing. Mike's expression shifted from skepticism to concern. Rebecca, you're talking about accusing a federal judge of misconduct. That's not a road you want to go down without ironclad evidence. That's why I need to dig deeper, she said. I've sent an interview request to Walter Simmons. He's 80 years old now, still in Rockwell Federal. Mike shook his head. This is ancient history. Why does it matter now? Rebecca pulled out one final document, a recent obituary. Because Judge Samuel Reynolds died 3 months ago, and suddenly, people might be willing to talk. 2 weeks later, Rebecca sat across from Walter Simmons in Rockwell's visitation room. He was thinner than she expected, with paper-like skin and cloudy blue eyes that still held a spark of intelligence. His hands, spotted with age, rested calmly on the table between them. I've received many interview requests over the years, Walter said, his voice surprisingly clear. Why should I talk to you? Rebecca placed a folder on the table. Because I found something the others didn't. She slid across a photocopy of an internal memo dated August 30th, 1960, 2 weeks before Walter's trial began. It was partially redacted, but clearly addressed to District Attorney Reynolds from Detective Harrison. Walter, read it slowly, his hands beginning to tremble. Insufficient evidence, recommend further investigation, concerns about witness reliability, he read aloud. Where did you find this? Buried in county archives, Rebecca replied. Filed under the wrong case number. This memo suggests the detectives themselves weren't convinced of your guilt. Walter looked up, 6 decades of cautious hope in his eyes. No one has ever found anything like this before. That's just the beginning, Rebecca said, reaching for her recorder. With your permission, I'd like to start from the very beginning. Tell me about the night Caroline Mason disappeared. As Walter began to speak, Rebecca glanced at the guard watching them from the corner. For the first time, she fully comprehended the magnitude of what she was undertaking, challenging a conviction that had shaped the lives of an entire town, the career of a powerful judge, and the 6-decade imprisonment of the elderly man before her. What she couldn't know then was that her first podcast episode would reach someone who had been keeping a secret about Caroline Mason since the summer of 1960. The Oak Ridge of 2022 bore little resemblance to the town Walter Simmons had known. The quaint Main Street had given way to chain stores, the old courthouse had been renovated beyond recognition, and most of the people who remembered the Caroline Mason case firsthand had either moved away or passed on. Rebecca pulled her rental car into the parking lot of the Oak Ridge Retirement Community, a sprawling single-story complex on what had once been farmland. According to her research, Edward Mills, former detective with the Oak Ridge Police Department, had retired here after a 30-year career. At 85, Mills was one of the few living links to the original investigation. He hadn't been the lead detective. Both Cooper and Harrison had died years ago. But as a young officer, he had been involved in the case that changed Oak Ridge forever. The nurse at the front desk directed Rebecca to a sunroom where Mills sat in a wheelchair, a plaid blanket across his lap despite the room's warmth. His eyes, roomy but alert, followed her approach. Detective Mills? I'm Rebecca Thompson. We spoke on the phone about the Caroline Mason case. Mills nodded slowly. Didn't think anyone still cared about that old business. Rebecca set up her recorder with Mills's permission. I'm researching it for a podcast series. I've been speaking with Walter Simmons. At the mention of Walter's name, a shadow crossed Mills's face. How is he? Still in prison, still maintaining his innocence. Mills looked out the window at the manicured lawn. 62 years, hard to imagine. You were one of the first officers at the Stillwater Bridge that morning, Rebecca prompted. What do you remember? Mills's weathered hands fidgeted with his blanket. It was my 2nd year on the force. Found the car just after dawn. Blue Ford, driver's door. Open. Girl's scarf on the passenger seat. And you called it in? Radioed Cooper and Harrison. They took over once they realized it was the mayor's daughter missing. He paused, seeming to retreat into memory. Things moved fast after that. Too fast looking back. Rebecca leaned forward. What do? You mean, too fast? Mills glanced around the sunroom, though they were alone. There was pressure. Mayer was on the phone with the chief every hour. Reynolds, the DA, was at the station constantly. Everyone wanted the case solved yesterday. Did that pressure affect the investigation? Mills was quiet for so long that Rebecca thought he might not answer. Finally, he said, "We didn't have the evidence we should have had for a murder charge. No body, no witnesses to any crime. Just circumstances that looked bad for the Simmons boy." Then why was he charged? Reynolds was convinced, or wanted to be convinced. Mills's voice dropped. There were other angles we should have pursued. Rebecca felt her pulse quicken. Such as? The Parsons family. Left town the same week Caroline disappeared. Peter worked for the mayor, handled his finances. His wife and teenage daughter just up and gone overnight. We should have looked harder at that connection. Rebecca made a note. Did you share these concerns? Tried to. Cooper told me to stick to traffic duty. I was just a kid, what did I know? His eyes, suddenly clearer, locked onto Rebecca's. But I knew enough to see when a case wasn't solid. And this one was built on quicksand. As Rebecca drove back to her hotel, her mind raced. She pulled over to make a quick call to her researcher in Chicago. I need everything you can find on the Parsons family. Peter Parsons worked for Mayor Mason in 1960, had a wife and daughter. They left. Oak Ridge suddenly around the time Caroline disappeared. She hung up and stared at her notes. For the first time, she had confirmation from someone inside the investigation that Walter's case had been mishandled. But Mills's revelation about the Parsons family opened a new avenue altogether, one that no one had explored in 62 years. Back at the hotel, Rebecca found an email waiting. Found something interesting about Peter Parsons. Call me ASAP. The county records office in Phoenix, Arizona was cooler than the blistering heat outside, but Rebecca barely noticed the temperature change as she followed the archivist through rows of filing cabinets. Marriage records from 1960 to 1965, the woman said, gesturing to a drawer. Though I'm not sure why you'd come all this way when most of these are digitized. Rebecca smiled politely. Sometimes the paper tells you things the scans don't. After the archivist left, Rebecca pulled on cotton gloves and began her search. Her researcher had found a marriage certificate for an Eleanor Parsons in Phoenix, dated October 1960, just 6 weeks after Caroline Mason's disappearance. The timing was too coincidental to ignore. An hour into her search, she found it. The yellowed document showing that Eleanor Parsons, 18, had married James Wilson, 24. The bride's parents were listed as Peter and Margaret Parsons, formerly of Ohio. Rebecca photographed the document, then checked her watch. She had another appointment in an hour, one that had taken considerable effort to arrange. Sunnyview Assisted Living Center was a high-end facility on the outskirts of Phoenix. The receptionist directed Rebecca to a garden patio where Margaret Wilson sat in a wicker chair, a blanket over her legs despite the warm day. At 87, Margaret Wilson's face was deeply lined, her white hair neatly styled. She eyed Rebecca warily as she approached. "Mrs. Wilson, thank you for agreeing to see me. I'm Rebecca Thompson." "You said you were researching historical cases from Ohio," Margaret said. "I've lived in Arizona for over 60 years. I'm not sure how I can help." Rebecca sat carefully. "I'm investigating the disappearance of Caroline Mason in Oak Ridge, 1960. You testified at Walter Simmons' trial. You were the only eyewitness who placed Walter and Caroline together that night." Margaret's hands clutched her blanket. "That was a long time ago. Your testimony was crucial to his conviction," Rebecca continued. "You stated under oath that you saw them arguing in the parking lot, that he followed her out. But according to the original police statements I've found, you initially told officers you didn't see anything unusual that night." Color drained from Margaret's face. "Who sent you here?" "No one sent me. I'm a journalist following evidence." Rebecca leaned forward. "Mrs. Wilson, Walter Simmons has spent 62 years in prison. If there's anything about your testimony that wasn't accurate, you don't understand the pressure." Margaret interrupted, her voice suddenly fierce. "The whole town was hysterical. A girl was missing. They needed someone to blame." "So you lied under oath?" Margaret looked away. "They came to my house, Reynolds and Cooper, said they knew it was Walter but needed witnesses. Said if I didn't cooperate, they'd investigate my husband for tax fraud. We had just gotten married. James had a good job at the bank. I couldn't risk it." Rebecca felt a chill despite the heat. "Did you know the Parsons family? Eleanor Parsons specifically?" Margaret's eyes widened. "How did you—" "It's interesting that you left Oak Ridge right after the trial, and that Eleanor Parsons got married here in Phoenix around the same time Caroline disappeared." "You need to leave," Margaret said, her voice shaking. "I've said too much already. Mrs. Wilson, if you know something about what really happened to Caroline—" "I don't know anything about Caroline," she snapped, then more quietly. "But I suggest you find Eleanor, if she's still alive." As Rebecca walked back to her car, her phone rang. It was her editor. "The first episode of Buried Truth just dropped," Mike said. "It's blowing up online. People are calling for Walter's case to be reopened." Rebecca started her car. "That's good because I'm just getting started. I need you to find someone for me. Eleanor Parsons Wilson. She'd be around 80 now if she's still alive." "Who is she?" Rebecca pulled onto the highway. "I'm beginning to think she might be the key to everything." The evidence storage facility for the Oak Ridge County Sheriff's Department resembled a warehouse more than an official building, tucked away on the outskirts of town. Rebecca showed her press credentials and the court order she'd fought 3 weeks to obtain to a bored-looking deputy. "Box 60 CR 137, she said. "The Caroline Mason case." The deputy raised his eyebrows. "That's ancient history. You sure it's still here?" "According to your records, it was never destroyed." 20 minutes later, Rebecca stood before a dusty cardboard box labeled, with faded marker. Her hands trembled slightly as she signed the chain of custody form. This box potentially contained physical evidence that no one had examined with modern forensic techniques. "You've got 2 hours, the deputy said, leaving her in a small examination room with a table and overhead light. Rebecca donned gloves and carefully opened the box. Inside were evidence bags, each with a numbered tag and description. She methodically photographed each item before examination. Caroline's scarf, found in Walter's car, soil samples from the riverbank, fingerprint cards, a partial AD, shoeprint cast from the muddy shore. Midway through the box, she found something unexpected. A sealed evidence bag containing what appeared to be a handkerchief with brownish stains. The tag read, "Item Dowrier 17, cloth with suspected blood, recovered from bridge railing." Rebecca checked the trial transcripts on her laptop. Item number 17 had never been mentioned in court. In fact, according to the prosecution's exhibits list, they jumped from item number 16 to item number 18. "They buried evidence," she whispered to herself. She continued and found another surprise at the bottom of the box, a charred notebook with a partial diary entry still legible. The entry was dated the day of Caroline's disappearance. "Can't stay here anymore. P says we'll leave tonight after the dance, says his wife won't contest it if—" The rest was burned away. Again, Rebecca checked the trial documents. No diary was ever entered as evidence or mentioned by the prosecution. She carefully repacked the items, making detailed notes, then approached the deputy. "I need these 2 items sent to LabCorp for modern DNA testing," she said, presenting the handkerchief and scarf. "I have a court order for that as well." 2 weeks later, Rebecca sat in a sterile conference room at LabCorp's regional facility. Dr. Anita Sharma, the senior forensic analyst, spread several reports on the table. "The results are quite definitive," Dr. Sharma began. "The blood on the handkerchief does not match the DNA profile we created from Caroline Mason's hairbrush that you provided." Rebecca leaned forward. "Whose blood is it?" "We can't say without a comparison sample, but we can tell you it's from a male." "Could it be Walter's?" Dr. Sharma shook her head. We compared it to the cheek swab you obtained from Mr. Simmons. It's not his DNA either. Rebecca's mind raced. So we have male blood at the scene that doesn't belong to Walter. Blood evidence that was never mentioned at trial. There's more, Dr. Sharma continued. The scarf found in Walter's car. We found multiple DNA traces. None match Walter. Simmons. And Caroline? There are female DNA traces consistent with Caroline's profile from the hairbrush, but also another female's DNA, and the same unknown male from the handkerchief. Rebecca drove back to her hotel in a daze. The DNA evidence suggested at least 3 people had been at that bridge the night Caroline disappeared. Caroline herself, an unknown man and an unknown woman, but not Walter Simmons. Her phone rang, her researcher in Chicago. I found her, he said without preamble. Eleanor Parsons Wilson. She's alive, living under another name in Santa Fe, New Mexico. How certain are you it's her? The age matches, the timeline fits, and get this, she worked for years as an artist. I found a gallery showing from 2010 with her picture. Rebecca, she's the spitting image of Caroline Mason. Rebecca pulled over, her heart pounding. Send me everything you have. I'm getting on the first flight to Santa Fe. Rebecca's evidence packet sat untouched on District Attorney Victoria Mendez's desk. Sunlight streamed through the windows of the modern Oak Ridge County Courthouse, a stark contrast to the imposing building where Walter had been convicted 6 decades earlier. Ms. Thompson, Mendez began, her voice measured. I appreciate the thoroughness of your investigation, but you're asking us to reopen a 62-year-old case based on what you've presented here. What I've presented, Rebecca countered, is exculpatory DNA evidence that was never considered at trial, testimony from a former officer about the rushed investigation, and a recantation from the key witness who admits she lied under oath. Mendez, a career prosecutor in her 50s, leaned back in her chair. The DNA testing is compelling, I'll grant you that, but contamination is a significant concern with evidence this old. The samples were properly sealed. LabCorp's analysis specifically addressed potential degradation. And your theory about this Eleanor Parsons? That she's actually Caroline Mason who faked her own disappearance? Mendez shook her head. That's speculation at best. I'm not asking you to accept my theory, Rebecca said, fighting to keep frustration from her voice. I'm asking you to acknowledge that Walter Simmons deserves a new trial based on evidence that wasn't available in 1960. Mendez stood and walked to the window. Ms. Thompson, do you understand the precedent this would set? If we start reopening cases from that era based on modern forensic standards, the floodgates would open. So an innocent man remains in prison because it's administratively inconvenient to correct a mistake? The DA's expression hardened. That's not what I said. But there are processes, procedures. The conviction has been upheld through multiple appeals, none of which had access to this DNA evidence. Even so, there are strict limitations on post-conviction relief. The statute of limitations for introducing new evidence expired decades ago. Rebecca felt a chill. You're saying that even with proof of his innocence, the law won't allow Walter to be exonerated? I'm saying the legal barriers are significant. Mendez returned to her desk. Look, I understand your passion for this case, but the judicial system values finality. After 62 years, to suggest we got it wrong would undermine public confidence in the entire system. The system got it wrong, Rebecca said quietly. And every day Walter spends in prison compounds that injustice. Mendez gathered the documents, handing them back to Rebecca. I'm sorry, but the Oak Ridge County Prosecutor's Office will not be filing a motion to reopen this case. Rebecca left the courthouse, her hands shaking with anger. In the car, she called her editor. They're blocking it on procedural grounds, she said. They'd rather let an innocent man die in prison than admit they made a mistake. So what's your next move? Mike asked. Rebecca started the car. We release the next podcast episode, all of it. The DNA evidence, Margaret's recantation, the connection to Eleanor Parsons. If the legal system won't act, maybe public pressure will. 2 days later, Buried Truth. Episode 3 dropped. Within hours, Justice for Walter was trending nationwide. News outlets picked up the story. Calls flooded the governor's office and the DA. Rebecca watched from her hotel room as protesters gathered outside the courthouse, carrying signs demanding Walter's release. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "You're getting too close. Some secrets should stay buried." She stared at the message, then at the growing crowd below her window. After a moment's hesitation, she took a screenshot and forwarded it to Mike with a brief message. "If anything happens to me, follow the Eleanor Parsons lead." Then she packed her bag. She had a flight to catch to Santa Fe, and possibly the answer to a 62-year-old mystery. The courtroom was packed to capacity on the morning of Walter Simmons's hearing. After weeks of public pressure, Governor Harris had appointed a special counsel to review the case, and Judge Maria Gonzalez had agreed to hear arguments on whether new evidence warranted a formal review of the conviction. Walter sat at the defense table, his thin frame nearly lost in a suit that hung from his shoulders. At 80, he appeared frail, yet there was a newfound alertness in his eyes as he took in the proceedings. Rebecca sat directly behind him, her recorder running, her notebook open. Special counsel James Liu addressed the court first. "Your Honor, in light of the DNA evidence that was not available at the time of the original trial and the recanted testimony of a key witness, we believe there are significant grounds to question the validity of Mr. Simmons's conviction." Assistant District Attorney Mark Fletcher countered, "While we acknowledge the new scientific evidence, the state maintains that the procedural timeline for introducing such evidence has long expired. Furthermore, the absence of Mr. Simmons's DNA doesn't exonerate him. It merely fails to confirm his presence." Judge Gonzalez, a no-nonsense jurist with 30 years on the bench, interrupted. "Mr. Fletcher, are you suggesting that we should keep a potentially innocent man incarcerated because of procedural technicalities?" "Your Honor, I'm suggesting that the judicial system requires structure and finality. Without it, we might occasionally have to admit we were wrong," she finished for him. "Continue." As the legal arguments continued, Rebecca noticed a stir at the back of the courtroom. An elderly man entered, walking slowly but deliberately toward an empty seat in the gallery. With a shock, she recognized him from photographs. Samuel Reynolds, now in his late 90s but still imposing in a tailored suit. The former prosecutor, whose career had been built on Walter's conviction, had emerged from retirement to observe the proceedings. Their eyes met briefly across the courtroom. Reynolds' expression revealed nothing, but the message in his presence was clear. He was still defending his victory from 1960. Walter's new attorney, pro bono from a prestigious law firm, presented the DNA findings. The blood evidence found at the scene, never introduced at trial, belongs to neither the victim nor Mr. Simmons. This alone constitutes Brady material that the prosecution was obligated to disclose. As the morning progressed, Judge Gonzalez asked increasingly pointed questions of the state's representatives. By the lunch recess, the momentum seemed to be shifting in Walter's favor. In the hallway, Rebecca approached Reynolds, who stood alone near a window. "Judge Reynolds," she began. "Rebecca Thompson. I'm the journalist." "I know who you are, Ms. Thompson," he interrupted, his voice still commanding despite his age. "You've created quite a spectacle with your podcast. I've uncovered evidence that Walter Simmons is innocent, evidence that your office had in 1960. Reynolds' eyes narrowed. "You weren't there. You can't possibly understand the context of the time. Explain it to me then. Why suppress the blood evidence? Why pressure Margaret Wilson to lie on the stand?" "You're making accusations without understanding the complexities of the case," he said coldly. "Some situations require difficult decisions for the greater good." "The greater good?" Rebecca felt her professional detachment slipping. "A man lost his entire life while you built a career on his wrongful conviction. Something flickered in Reynolds's eyes. Not guilt, but perhaps the faintest recognition that his legacy was at stake. He leaned closer, his voice barely audible. "Be careful pursuing this, Ms. Thompson. Some questions are better left unanswered." Before Rebecca could respond, the bailiff announced the court was reconvening. As they filed back in, Walter caught her eye and nodded slightly, a gesture of gratitude regardless of the outcome. Judge Gonzalez took her seat, surveying the crowded courtroom before speaking. "After reviewing the evidence and arguments presented this morning, I am ordering a full evidentiary hearing on Mr. Simmons's petition for relief. Furthermore," she continued over the murmurs in the courtroom, "pending that hearing, I am ordering Mr. Simmons' release on his own recognizance." The gallery erupted. Walter sat motionless, as if unable to comprehend the words. Rebecca watched as Reynolds slipped out a side door, his face unreadable. The judge's gavel cut through the noise. "Mr. Simmons has spent 62 years in prison. If we have made a mistake, every day of continued incarceration compounds that injustice. Bailiff, please process Mr. Simmons' release." The small apartment Rebecca had arranged for Walter overlooked a park in downtown Oak Ridge. Sunlight streamed through windows that had no bars, illuminating walls that could be decorated, a kitchen where meals could be prepared at any hour, and doors that opened from the inside. "It's not much," Rebecca said apologetically as she set down Walter's few belongings, mainly books, journals, and the clothes donated by a local charity. Walter stood in the center of the living room, turning slowly as if to absorb every detail. "It's enormous," he said softly. At first, Walter approached his freedom with the cautious routine of institutionalization. He woke at 5:30 a.m. precisely, made his bed with military corners, and ate meals at exactly the same times. He flinched at sudden noises and stood with his back to walls. "The world is so loud now," he told Rebecca one afternoon as they walked through the park. Cars whooshed by, people chatted on phones, music spilled from cafes. Everything moves. So fast. Rebecca had arranged for a therapist specialized in reintegration, a social worker, and a physician. Walter approached each meeting with the same quiet dignity, though his eyes often revealed the overwhelm he felt. A week after his release, Rebecca found Walter sitting on a bench watching children play on a playground. "How are you feeling today?" she asked, joining him. Walter considered the question carefully, as he did all questions. "I keep expecting to wake up back in my cell, to find this was all a dream." "It's not a dream," Rebecca assured him. "Yesterday, I walked 8 blocks just because I could." A small smile crossed his face. "I bought an ice cream cone and ate it in the sun." These small victories, ordering coffee in a cafe, learning to use a smartphone, watching sunset from a rooftop, were monumentally significant. But underneath them ran the current of an unfinished journey. Walter was free but not exonerated, and Caroline Mason's fate remained unknown. One evening, as Rebecca helped Walter sort through sympathy cards and supportive messages that had poured in from across the country, he suddenly asked, "Do you think she's still alive, Caroline?" Rebecca hesitated. She hadn't shared her Eleanor Parsons theory with Walter, not wanting to give him false hope. "I don't know, but I'm still looking for answers." "I dream about her sometimes," Walter said. "Not as she was then, but as she would be now. An old woman, like me. Both of us with our lives behind us." The next morning, Rebecca arrived to find Walter standing before a wall he had transformed. Photos, newspaper clippings, and notes were arranged in a timeline spanning 62 years. "I needed to see it all together," he explained, "to understand what happened to me." Rebecca studied the wall, impressed by Walter's methodical approach. "You would have made a good investigator." "I've had a lot of time to think." His finger traced the timeline to a photograph of Samuel Reynolds from the original trial. "He knows more than he ever admitted. You saw it in his eyes at the hearing." "I'm still trying to track him down for a real interview," Rebecca said. "He's been avoiding me." Walter nodded toward the window, where autumn leaves were beginning to fall. I may not have much time left. Before I die, I want to look him in the eyes and ask him why. That evening, after Rebecca had left, Walter carefully removed his journals from a shelf, 62 volumes of his thoughts, observations, and hopes, written across a lifetime of confinement. He opened the first one, yellowed with age, to the sentence he had written daily for decades. If I am innocent, someday someone will prove it. With a steady hand, despite his age, he drew a line through the if. Across town in his well-appointed home, Samuel Reynolds sat in his study, a glass of scotch in his trembling hand, watching Rebecca's latest podcast episode on his computer. His phone rang, a number he didn't recognize. "Mr. Reynolds?" a woman's voice said. "My name is Eleanor Wilson. I believe you know who I am. We need to talk about Caroline Mason." The document lay on Rebecca's hotel bed, its yellowed edges and faded typeface betraying its age. Her hands shook as she photographed each page, ensuring she had backup copies before proceeding. The court clerk who had slipped it to her had been clear. This was misfiled deliberately. It was never meant to be found. The memorandum was dated September 5, 1960, 10 days before Walter's trial began. It was addressed to District Attorney Samuel Reynolds from his deputy, marked "Confidential" in red stamp across the top. Rebecca read it again, her journalistic skepticism warring with the bombshell contents. Sam reviewed all evidence in the Mason case. Significant concerns: 1. No body. 2. Witness statements inconsistent. 3. Simmons. Confession obtained under duress. 4. Blood at scene doesn't match suspect or victim. Recommend dropping charges pending further investigation. Also troubling. Mayor called again about the Parsons financial records. Confirms they're missing. Could be connection between Parsons' departure and girls' disappearance. Worth exploring before proceeding against Simmons. Please advise. Bill. At the bottom, in handwritten notation, Reynolds had scrawled his response. Bill. Proceed as planned with Simmons. Mason needs closure politically. Parsons' angle too complicated could implicate Mayor. Better. A clean conviction than a messy truth. Destroy this after reading. SR. Rebecca sat back, mind racing. This wasn't just evidence of a rush to judgment. It was proof of deliberate misconduct. Reynolds had knowingly prosecuted Walter while suppressing evidence and ignoring viable alternative. Suspects. She called Walter immediately. I found something big, a memo showing Reynolds knew you might be innocent but prosecuted anyway. There was silence on the line before Walter's voice, steady despite the bombshell. He sacrificed my life for political convenience. This could be enough to fully exonerate you, Rebecca said, and maybe criminal charges against Reynolds even now. After all this time, Walter mused, the truth was buried in a filing cabinet. Rebecca hesitated before asking her next question. There's a reference to financial records the Parsons had. Records that might have implicated the mayor. Do you know anything about that? No, Walter said, but it explains why they were so quick to find a scapegoat. As she hung up, Rebecca's phone immediately rang again, an unknown number with a Santa Fe area code. Ms. Thompson, this is Eleanor. Wilson, I believe you've been looking for me. Rebecca's heart raced. Yes, I have. I saw your podcast about Walter Simmons. A heavy pause. I think it's time I told the truth about what happened to Caroline Mason. I'd like to meet with you, Rebecca said carefully. I'm flying to Oak Ridge. Tomorrow. There's someone else I need to see first. Meet me at the Stillwater Bridge at 2 p.m. the day after. Ms. Wilson, Rebecca ventured. Are you Caroline Mason? The line was silent for a moment. Then, bring Walter Simmons with you. He deserves to hear this directly from me. The call ended, leaving Rebecca staring at the incriminating memo and her silent phone, realizing she was on the verge of unraveling a 62-year-old deception that had cost a man his entire life. The evening news broadcast flickered on television screens across Oak Ridge, the anchor's serious expression filling The Frame. Breaking news tonight as the Walter Simmons case takes another dramatic turn. Journalist Rebecca Thompson has uncovered what appears to be a smoking gun, a 1960 memorandum showing that prosecutors deliberately suppressed evidence pointing to Simmons's innocence. The document, which we've independently verified, suggests former District Attorney Samuel Reynolds knowingly prosecuted a man he believed might be innocent. In his living room, Walter watched the broadcast with a stillness born from decades of contained emotion. The truth, so long denied, was finally emerging into public light. Across town, Samuel Reynolds also watched, his aged hands gripping his wheelchair armrests. His nurse hovered nearby, concerned by his elevated heart rate. "Sir, perhaps you should turn this off," she suggested. "No," Reynolds said firmly. "I need to see this." The doorbell rang. Reynolds nodded to his nurse, who admitted a slender, elegant woman in her early 80s. Despite her age, she carried herself with remarkable poise, her silver hair swept into a neat bun. "Judge Reynolds," she said, stepping into the living room. "You know who I am." Reynolds' eyes widened slightly. "Eleanor, or should I say Caroline?" She approached, standing before him. "I saw the podcast, the evidence they found. So you've come to what? Confess? After 62 years? His voice carried a bitterness that surprised even him. "I've come to tell you I'm going public tomorrow. I'm meeting Walter Simmons and that journalist at the bridge where it all started." She paused, studying his reaction. "I thought you deserved to know first, since we both kept this secret." Reynolds laughed hollowly. "How considerate. And what exactly will you tell them?" "Everything. About Father's embezzlement. About Peter discovering it. About our plan to disappear together." Her eyes hardened. "About how you and Father decided Walter Simmons was expendable to protect the Mason family reputation." "It wasn't that simple," Reynolds protested. "The town needed resolution. Your father's position." "My father was a thief who let an innocent boy go to prison," she interrupted. "And you were his willing accomplice. I've lived with this shame for 62 years, watching from afar as Walter lost everything, while I had a life, a family, years in the sun that he spent in a cell." Reynolds turned away, unable to meet her gaze. "Why now? Why not 20 years ago, or 40? Fear, cowardice, the comfort of my secret life." She moved toward the door. "But I'm dying, Samuel. Cancer. 6 months, maybe less. I won't take this to my grave." As she left, Reynolds remained motionless, the television still broadcasting the scandal that would destroy his legacy. His nurse returned, alarmed by his pallor. "Sir, should I call your doctor?" Reynolds shook his head. He reached for his phone, dialing with shaking fingers. "It's Samuel Reynolds," he said, when the call connected. "I need to speak with Rebecca Thompson immediately. Tell her I'm ready to confess." At her hotel, Rebecca was packing recording equipment for tomorrow's meeting when her phone rang. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar number. "Ms. Thompson, I have Samuel Reynolds on the line." "For you? He says it's urgent." Rebecca's breath caught. "Put him through." As she accepted the call, she couldn't know that across town, Walter was receiving his own unexpected visitor, a court clerk with an envelope containing his official exoneration papers, signed by the governor after the memo went public. Tomorrow at the bridge, the full truth would finally emerge. But tonight, the key players in this decades-long tragedy were making their final preparations for a reckoning 62 years in the making. Stillwater Bridge looked much the same as it had in 1960, a simple steel structure, spanning the river that had allegedly claimed Caroline Mason's life. The autumn sun cast long shadows across the water as Walter Simmons stood at the spot where his life had changed forever. Rebecca waited nearby, recording equipment ready, but unobtrusive. This moment wasn't about her podcast anymore. It was about truth and closure for a man who had lost everything. A car approached, parking at the bridge's entrance. The woman who emerged walked slowly but purposefully. Eleanor Wilson, once Caroline Mason, had aged gracefully, her bearing still reminiscent of the mayor's daughter who had disappeared decades ago. Walter turned as she approached, his expression impossible to read. For a moment, they simply regarded each other, two people whose lives had been inextricably linked by events in 1960, now meeting as octogenarians. "Mr. Simmons," she said finally, her voice steady. "I can't begin to imagine what you must think of me." Walter studied her face. "You look like your pictures," he said simply. "I used to wonder if you were really dead." "I wasn't," she replied. "But in many ways, Caroline Mason did die that night." They moved to a bench overlooking the river. Eleanor began her story. How her father, the respected Mayor Mason, had been embezzling town funds for years. How Peter Parsons, his accountant, had discovered the theft and threatened exposure unless the mayor approved his relationship with Caroline, which the mayor had vehemently opposed. "Peter and I planned to run away that night after the dance," she explained. "We staged my disappearance to look like foul play so no one would search for us." Her voice broke. "We never imagined someone else would be blamed. But when I was arrested," Walter said, "you stayed silent." Eleanor nodded, tears welling. "My father called us in Arizona. He said if I ever came forward, he'd be ruined, jailed, and Peter would be charged as an accomplice. I was 18, frightened. I convinced myself you'd be acquitted. But I wasn't," Walter said quietly. "When you were convicted, I wanted to come forward. Peter stopped me, said it was too late, that I'd be charged too." She wiped her eyes. "Over the years, it became easier to stay silent. I built a life as Eleanor Wilson, had children, grandchildren, while I sat in a cell," Walter finished, "for a crime that never happened." Rebecca watched as Walter absorbed the truth that had eluded him for 62 years. His hands trembled slightly, but his voice remained calm. "Samuel Reynolds confessed everything last night," Rebecca said gently. "How he and your father buried evidence, pressured witnesses. He's facing charges despite his age." Eleanor reached tentatively for Walter's weathered hand. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I needed you to hear the truth from me before I die." Walter looked at the river, then back at the woman whose disappearance had defined his existence. 62 years of anger and injustice hung in the balance. "I don't have time left for hatred," he said finally. "It took everything else from me. It won't take my final years too." As they sat together on that bridge, the wrongfully convicted man, the woman who had disappeared, and the journalist who had uncovered the truth, the afternoon sun began its descent, casting golden light over the Stillwater River. Walter's case would spark judicial reforms across the country. Eleanor's confession would bring closure to a town built on lies. And Rebecca's investigation would remind a nation that justice, though delayed, must never be abandoned. For Walter Simmons, freedom had come too late to reclaim his lost life. But in that moment of truth on Stillwater Bridge, he found something he thought forever beyond his reach: peace.